Looking ahead, challenges and opportunities in the changing world. Welcome to Talking Economics, podcast launched on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the Center for Economic Research and Graduate Education, Economics Institute. Has the current pandemic changed the role of women in family, society, and work? And how does the crisis affect women in developing countries? In today's podcast, we will take a closer look at these and other questions related to gender and development economics. My name is Katarina Stehlíková, and it is my pleasure to welcome Martina Miotto, a Post-Doctoral Fellow at the Economic Institute of the Czech Academy of Sciences and a Research Associate of the CERGE Research Center in Warwick. Martina holds a Ph.D. degree from the University of Warwick. Her research interests lie in the fields of development economics and economic history, with a special focus on the interconnection between the two. Among others, Martina has recently co-authored a study, Gender and the COVID Crisis. Welcome, Martina.
Hi, thanks for having me here.
Well, jumping right to the topic, development economics and economic history sounds like an interesting combination. So what are we going to focus on today?
So today we're going to focus a little bit more on development economics. I think we'll leave economic history to a later podcast session if you'll invite me again. It would be too long to put the two of them together. But I want to talk today about development economics and my work and my thoughts that I have on development economic and gender. So we're gonna talk about women today, women who live in developing countries. So these are the women, who really live in real poverty every day. These are the women who, during COVID times, they can't afford the basic safety measures that we can afford, like masks or even just social distancing, So I want to think about them today and focus on this particular section of the world.
Excellent. I think, especially in crises, we have a tendency to focus just on ourselves, on our own problems. So it is great to have you here to expand our horizons. Jumping to the first question, what would you say is the biggest challenge in this field?
So the biggest challenge in development economics, from a very practical perspective, and in my view, comes from the interruption of all of the field activities that COVID imposed to the many researchers like me. And what do I mean with this? So many development economists work with data that they themselves produce. So by going to developing countries, observing that reality and studying it on the ground, right? So say that, for instance, you want to study the effect of opening a school on whether opening schools in developing countries decreases child labor. So if there is no data available to answer your question, you have to go and collect your data. You have to produce them yourself, right? So you need to go there, build up the school, and then try to check whether child labor is decreasing, increasing, or so what, before and after the opening of the school. Now, the challenge that COVID brought is that during the pandemic, we could not keep working on the field. We could not open, in my example, that new school. Or even if we had it open, because of school closures due to the pandemic, we could not operate and study the effect on child labor, right? So this is just an example I came up with, but in general, many development economists who base their own research and also their own careers on field studies have seen their projects either interrupted or cancelled. So the big challenge here is actually twofold. On the one hand, you can choose to completely redesign your project and trying to make it work, which is challenging, or it's a really challenging thing to do on the fly. And on the other hand, you can choose to stop the project, but your career as a development economist depends on this type of projects. So you need to be fast and flexible in changing the way you work or the topics you work on.
This sounds really a huge challenge in general. I know that you work in Bangladesh, you had your own project. So what about you specifically? Had the pandemic affected your projects and your own work?
Yeah, definitely it has. So I'll give you an example coming definitely from my story. So with my team, with another colleague from CERGE-EI, we are studying how menstrual health affect health and work productivity of poor women in the Bangladeshi garment factories. Okay, so you have to imagine these are the women who sew up our clothes, the clothes that we put on every day. This shirt that I have on today, I actually took it directly from the factory when I was in Bangladesh. So this project started back in 2018, and you have to have a lot of face-to-face work when you're there. You have to go to the factories, you have to survey workers, you have to work with them, and so on and so forth. So you have to establish a presence in the factories. And the project, which started back in 2018, was supposed to last till around May 2020. But then COVID came, and the outbreak in Bangladesh, I think it was around the first half of March, and everything had to be rethought and redone because we could not establish a presence in the factories anymore. Either the factories closed, but even when they reopened, we could not go. We could not send our local team members to the factories because we would increase the chances that they would get the virus, right? So basically, you start the project which aim is to help poor women, in this case, helping them with their menstrual health. So a project that evolves around the figure of women. And then you have to stop. And, like when you stop your project in the middle of it, it can have big consequences. And so we were able to restructure it a little bit and keep going on. But the limitations that we have to go through because of COVID in doing our work, this could definitely affect the way the study that we are performing, right? So this is just an example taken from my personal experience, but I can tell you that many other colleagues, many other research projects that were performing in the field at the time of the COVID outbreak, especially in developing countries, they were interrupted or cancelled. And it's very sad, especially if you think that COVID hit the most women and women in developing countries. It's sad to think that all of these projects aiming at improving people and women's lives have been impaired. And not only they have been impaired because of the situation in the field change, but for some of us, luckily it didn't happen to me in particular, also fundings to pursue in-field research were cut. So many colleagues who were receiving fundings from some specific donors saw their research money cut overnight. Like they had to stop overnight doing their projects. And remember, also their career depends on these projects, right? So that was very challenging. And I'd say that there might be other challenges for sure, but this operational challenge, for me, it was the biggest one.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that women were impacted more by the pandemic, and this is something that we've been hearing and reading in the papers as well. So this seems that the other dimension of your work is also getting into the spotlight, right? The gender economics.
Yeah.
What would you say are the topics that are getting most attention in this area, or that should be getting most attention?
This is a great question. So I think there are a couple of topics that are coming up now more than ever. One of them, for instance, is intra-household bargaining process and trying to understand whether the pandemic acted as a break to women and wives' empowerment, especially for mothers. For instance, important questions would be like, with schools closed for many weeks or months, who took care of the children? Who performed household tasks? And were these tasks reassigned on the basis of partners' free time or purely on a gender base? Right, these are questions that are extremely relevant and important. We know from research that women bargaining power grows hand in hand with employment possibilities and thus with income. So what happened to the bargaining equilibrium with COVID? Did women who lost their job lose also their bargaining power they had previously gained by working? Did they retain it? And I think it's very interesting to look at this area of research even after the pandemic will be over. I think it's important to understand whether these quote-unquote new and temporary roles adopted during the lockdown persist even after COVID will be only a bad memory. I can think about a couple of other topics. One, for instance, which is very delicate but very important as well. It's domestic violence. The whole discipline wonders whether a prolonged exposure to violent or abusive behavior, due to the very long lockdown without possibilities of going out, had or still keep having effect on the victims, which are unfortunately prevalently women. And you might wonder why this is anything to do with economics, but economics is a social science which studies individuals' behaviors and their consequences. And women who have been abused more than usual due to COVID lockdowns could be women who fell more likely into depression, who withdraw more from the labor market, who don't invest into their children's human capital, and so on and so forth. So these are extremely relevant questions which require on-time scientific research. And a third topic, maybe, I guess you hear less about this one. But when we talk about gender economics, usually we refer to women, and it's plentiful of reason to think about them, right? Like they are disadvantaged in so many aspects of life. But we should not forget also the men and how COVID can impact men's lives as well. So we know that men's jobs were relatively less affected by COVID with respect to women's one, which made men, in a lot of cases, the only breadwinners, even in families where earlier both partners were working. And you have to wonder if this is having any consequences on men. For instance, on their effort put during when they work, their performance. Now that they are the only breadwinner, are they motivated to work more? Or do they feel the pressure of it and they work less? And does this have any mental effect on them? How does this translate into the mental health of their children, and so on and so forth? So in a sense, I think that COVID reestablished some gender patterns within the household that I believe were overcome already in many parts of the world. And while 50 years ago, maybe many men would have been happy to be the only working person in the family, I'm not sure this is still a trait of many Western societies. And it's very interesting to explore what are the consequences of this kind of reimposition of some gender roles.
A huge number of interesting and relevant questions. What would you say are the main challenges in finding the answers to all these?
So I think there are many challenges. One of them, I guess, is the availability of up-to-date data to inform policymakers on the best economic-related strategies to undertake in this moment. Let me make you an example. And let me focus on the gender aspect of my research now. Say that you are an economist during COVID times and that the policymaker is seeking the best way to ensure gender equality in the labor market after COVID. So the goal is to find a way to make sure both women and men are re-entering the labor force in equal way, so they're having the same opportunities. So the first question you should ask yourself are, how were men and women jobs affected by the pandemic in the first place? Were they laid off at the same rate? And if they were not laid off, is there the possibility that women decided to stay at home and quit themselves their jobs just to provide for the family in times of pandemic? So to answer all these questions, what we need is up-to-date data so that we can be ready to inform the policymaker on time. Now, one first challenge here is to get the data, in my example, relative to the labor market situation. But while this is not a problem for sure for developed economies, it's a massive challenge in developing countries. Like the vast part of the population of developing countries work in informal jobs, then they are not registered with any authority. So there are not statistics at hand which are trustable. But now let's go back to developed economies. So say that now you're able to find data on the labor market, even divided by gender. So a big issue now, in my view at least, is to properly read and understand this data say that the data tell us that women were laid off more often than men. So now the good policymakers should then create policies to incentivize firms to hire more women. But what if these women are now, in a way, settled at home, and they feel that it's better to stay at home in the fear of next wave of pandemic? It's better to be at home and not to re-enter the labor market immediately. Well, in this case, the policymaker not only has to incentivize firms to hire more women, but they also have to incentivize women to leave the house and go to work. And these are very different policies. But we won't know any of this unless some research is done on how women's labor market decisions change after being laid off. And this type of research needs to be done on time to be able to ensure gender equality in the post-pandemic labor market. This is what I mean with up-to-date data to inform policymakers.
And so would you say that you see actually some initiatives that are starting to collect the data so that we have them on time?
I think even during the pandemic already, many surveys have started. I've seen many online surveys starting, and definitely there has been an effort to collect more data. For sure, in Czech Republic, I saw that kind of effort. I can't talk for developing countries this time because there it's a little bit more difficult. They're still going through the worst phase of the pandemic, some of them. But yes, I'm positive on that.
And related to what you mentioned before about the financial situation and funding cut, do you see any funding actually coming up in the direction of this data collection and
Yes.
analysis? So there was some refocus.
Yes, definitely. There has been many call for applications for grants, which focus was to collect new data and focus on COVID. I think that the part of it which is a little bit unfortunate as a junior economist is that in these times it's very difficult to win this kind of calls because obviously you don't have a machine already working in developing countries as senior development economists might have, right? And so it's right and it's fair that it's them getting the grant money because they can pursue the best research, and this is what we need now. At the same time, without grants to pursue our work as juniors, it's also difficult for us to produce research. So I've seen many grants available. I just think that it was a little bit more difficult this time for juniors, but this is not the focus. The focus is to get the data. So it's okay like that, I'd say.
There are initiatives going in these directions. And I'm glad you started to speak about your own research, your own position as an economist, because we covered development economics, we talked about gender economics, but what about you? You as a woman economist, how was your research, how was your life affected by the pandemic?
So I think I can speak for all academics, or I'm not sure all economists, but academics for sure. So not singularly to women, but for all of us. So most of us, not everyone, but most of us have been very lucky because we could pursue our job. We could just, bring it at home and keep working from home. Provided you have a computer, you could do it. So we didn't experience like big pitfall in our day-to-day operation. But at the same time, it was challenging to resettle your work at home and to have to reconstruct it completely. The standards in the discipline are not changing. Our requirements to promotion are still the same. We have to do research, we have to write about it, we have to publish our research in the best scientific journals possible, otherwise we don't proceed in our career. But working from home can be very challenging for so many reasons. So first of all, you need to motivate yourself every day to do something in complete autonomy. And it's not just the autonomy, it's also in the complete physical absence of colleagues to talk with, co-authors to work side by side with, or just senior mentors to approach through the corridors, And you also lack all of the networking that only real in-person conferences or seminars can give you. So we try to move all of these activities online, but it's just not the same. And this is just the motivation part of the problem, but there are other problems which are more pragmatic, like having the space to work from home, like the desk, the chairs, like some of us live in very small apartments. You have to also have a quiet environment to do it. And I guess this is especially challenging when you have young kids. So pursuing high quality research is challenging as it is. We wouldn't need PhDs otherwise to do it, right? So we can't think that doing it from home in different conditions comes at zero cost. I think we just can't. And on top of this, so one part of the job, which is very important, is also the teaching side. So we teach to students at university. And fortunately, teaching could be moved online, so students didn't lose at least like the lessons that they can learn. But like on the side of the teachers, you have to completely change your teaching methods. You want to be the best fit that students can have. But this means that you have to completely redesign the way you interact with students, the way you motivate them, the way you check whether they're following you, even when they're in front of, even when you are in front of black cameras because they don't turn it on. You need to change the way you test them. Like it's much easier to cheat now during exams because students are not in front of you. So everything had to be completely redesigned, and it had to be done on the fly. And there was no time to understand what worked better. And this was not an easy task for academics as a whole. It took a lot of time.
So hopefully these challenging times will be over soon with the vaccines and with the
I hope so.
more research.
I really hope so.
I would go to the conclusion that you posed a lot of questions, a lot of challenges, introduced a lot of challenges. But you said PhDs, researchers are here to actually help addressing them. So do you see opportunities in your field specifically to help address these huge challenges?
This is an interesting and difficult question. So let me try to speak to it. So this whole unfortunate situation created by COVID definitely raised once again the question of inequality. And what do I mean with that? Like when I think about inequalities, I think about disparities between, for instance, rich and poor countries, or between rich and poor people in the same country, between ethnicities, or between genders, as we talked about. I mean, obviously, the topic of inequality was never forgotten, but I feel that COVID put it right back in front of our eyes. We see it in the news more often. We read it more often about it in the newspaper. So it's there. It's in front of our eyes. And my field, especially the development side of it, which is the one whose goal is to understand how to close these gaps, has now, I believe, an ulterior motive to keep fighting for this, to keep researching on the topic, to keep asking for more space for it in scientific journals. And I also think we will witness a new wave of young PhD students more interested in this type of research. And this is an opportunity we cannot lose. The disparities created by COVID are growing every day. Think about how we are redistributing vaccine worldwide, and it'll be clear to you. So I hope, and honestly, I think that the challenges that COVID brought in front of our eyes will act as a reminder to many of us, but also as an inspiration for a new generation of development economists.
Thank you for this optimistic, I would say, conclusion and summary. And thank you for being here with us.
No, it was a pleasure. Thanks for inviting.